Hello folks, this is Alistair Postquin from Falling Blocks Designs. You can find my books, patterns, etc. on my website at double-knitting.com. If you've been paying attention to my posts, you've probably heard the term off-the-grid double knitting a number of times. Like the metapixel knitting that I covered in the last live stream, off-the-grid is a phrase I sort of appropriated to describe in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, a type of colorwork design that I've used quite a bit. So before I talk about what off-the-grid is, let me talk about the grid. This is the grid, a digital frontier. This is the grid, the basis of all knitting patterns. Whether flat or in the round, stitches of the same size are stacked on top of each other and, when charted, are expressed in a grid. When texture is applied to the grid, stitch patterns are created, and when color work is applied to the grid, motif patterns are created. The grid may be pushed and pulled in different directions with short rows and shaping, but in general, it stays in a predictable grid sort of shape. Charts tend to be intuitive, a mere stylistic spin on the work you're actually doing. However, sometimes the grid isn't entirely adequate to describe something you're trying to do. Increases and decreases may push and pull the fabric in ways that the grid simply cannot adequately contain. The work can still be charted, but the chart and the finished work may not be immediately recognizable as related. So in a normal chart, the resulting knitted fabric looks pretty close to the charted motif. There we go. But take this chart back here again. A sort of elongated checkerboard pattern. Now let's add some increases and decreases. The result of knitting this is this chevron pattern. As you can see, they don't look a lot alike. But if you trust the chart, it will actually give you this chevron pattern. The increases and decreases are always paired to keep the stitch count stable from row to row, and they send the color work on the diagonal like this. If you look closely, you won't find a single stitch in this sample that sits straight up and down, except the edges. So, therefore, off the grid. So let's go back to the chart again. Note that I've kept the same underlying chart, but the increases and decreases have changed dramatically. There are more of them and they're more evenly spaced. Care to guess what this is going to work up as? Well, you'll find out at the end of the live stream. Oops. So, so off-the-grid double knitting works by, as I mentioned earlier, ensuring that the stitch count, or pair count in this case, is consistent from row to row, so long as no shaping is needed. This can be subtle or it can be dramatic, or it can be a combination of both. It doesn't actually even really have to be double knitting. As long as the color work is densely enough packed, it can work in stranded knitting as well. As a matter of fact, Kieran Foley, an Irish knit designer who I've worked with, has been doing it since the early 2000s in stranded knitting. So, contrary to popular belief, my discovery of Kieran's work was not the genesis of my off-the-grid style, although it did help me hone the techniques. I had been using decreases for quite some time for the crowns of hats, but the first piece that added increases was this hat, worked up in early 2009 out of some rustic hand-dyed worsted weight that I picked up at a farmer's market in my childhood hometown of Middlebury, Vermont. Clearly, this was the predecessor to Braddock. And this pattern was published in my first book, Extreme Double Knitting. The increases and decreases occur on both sides of the sort of Celtic banner motifs, and they happen in every row to keep the movement pretty dramatic. And as a matter of fact, the movement continues even after the banners are done to create this dramatic whirl pattern in the middle. and as a matter of fact, the more space there is between the banners, the more dramatic the whirl becomes. If you look at the whirl, and this one it's less dramatic. It's because it's larger yarn, therefore fewer stitches in between the banners. Here's finer yarn, more stitches in between the banners, therefore a more dramatic whirl. So the predecessor to Victorian raffia was the next up on my needles. As I realized the possibilities, I decided I needed to become proficient in all forms of double knit, increase and decrease. The best way I could do that was to work up a pattern that used a lot of them. So enter Kieran Foley and his Scandinavian pattern. Not only does this pattern use heavy increases and decreases to create these sort of chevron patterns in the river, the rivers that flow in and out of the other color work, but but also creates this flowing movement of the rivers themselves by subtle increases and decreases around their edges. So knowing how to do increases and decreases in double knitting, this would have been pretty easy for me to adapt just on its own, but I wanted something a little bit more. I wanted a little bit more rigorous practice in both increases and decreases, and so I recharted it so that I would end up with this sort of knots and crosses pattern rather than the chevrons that showed up in Kieran Foley's original. This piece had, at my count at the time, 14 different increase and decrease techniques, assuming that you count the knit and the purl separately. So, excuse me. This piece was actually what gave me the book deal, the original book deal for Extreme Double Knitting. I was working at it at a guild meeting where indie publisher Shannon Oki was giving a talk, and this was close to the beginning of Cooperative Press, her company, as a company. And during dinner, Shannon looked at my work and said, "You've got to do a book for me." And so I got a book deal, in a way. Initially, I'd assumed that I wasn't going to be able to use this piece in the book because it wasn't originally mine. And so I took the techniques and I added them into two other patterns, three in the end. The first was, of course, Braddock, which I showed earlier, and then the second was the Four Winds pattern. Now, the original Four Winds, as you can see here on the right, is all pixelated. It's a chart, a regular double knit chart, and on the left you can see the revised version, or the second option, initially published in Extreme Double Knitting in 2011. And as you can see, the points of the compass are smoothed out using the off-the-grid style. So this was a new use of this for me. So as the book took form, I wrote to Kieran and asked him if he'd allow me to publish my rendition of the Scandinavian pattern in my book. At the time, I was still a no-name designer with only a small handful of patterns released, and the answer was a predictable no. This was a bit of a blessing, honestly, as I wasn't sure that I'd be able to finish it in time to actually get it into the book. So I put it aside and I moved on to other things. I still wanted to show off what I learned by working on that pattern, and so I designed the Silk Road necktie. I've got it actually here. I have a few samples here that I can show, and this is one of them. You can see much more closely the spiral motif here. So the spirals are actually achieved a little bit of a visual trickery. I subtly modified the knots and crosses pattern inside the rivers of the Scandinavian modification that I had made, and instead of lining them up one on top of the other to make diamonds, I shifted them over by one and got spirals. And so this is a motif that I would revisit in the Eteria hat, and with some further experimentation in shifting the chevrons, the Hesperos scarf, and those two, by the way, I can't show because neither of them survived the fire and they haven't been reworked yet, but they are in progress. As well as this one, again, another piece that did not survive the fire. It's an untitled, as Vogue patterns tend to be, untitled double knit beanie, and I think number 28. But I don't have that many patterns in Vogue, so if you're interested in this one, you can just go search for me. So in 2014, well after Extreme Double Knitting had come out, but before I'd properly started working on Double or Nothing, Kieran Foley got back in touch, totally out of the blue. He said something to the effect of, and I can't find the email, I looked for it. He said something to the effect of, well, maybe we could do a collaborative piece after all. And of course, at this point, I had a book. I was an increasingly well-known designer. And so he reconsidered. And I dragged the Scandinavian modification out of the closet and I took a fresh look at it. Now, much had changed in my design aesthetic, and I was unwilling to accept some certain flaws that I had been willing to accept 5 years prior. It was about halfway finished, and I just decided to rip it all back to the beginning and start fresh. So here it is. This is the new at that time, Victorian raffia scarf. So Kieran and I now split the proceeds on this. You'll find it listed on KnitLab as well as on my site. So while I didn't do a lot with off-the-grid double knitting and Double or Nothing, the Hesperos scarf is basically an easier to read rehashing of my unpublished experiments in the movement of those chevrons to see about what other patterns might be generated if I shift over by 1, shift over by 2, shift over by 3, etc. And so I got spirals, I got Greek keys, I got various patterns beyond that, and I selected the ones that were the most accessible and put them into the scarf. There were more patterns that didn't actually end up in Hesperos, but who knows, maybe I'll do something else in the future with them. So other things that this sort of fed into was obviously double knit lace and the Adenith shawl, as well as the spring willow cowl, the double knit lace. Obviously, yarn overs are just another kind of increase. So this is still increasing and decreasing and using those techniques to push the lace around, but also to push, in this case, the color work around. So so I used some of the things that I learned in all of my adventures in off-the-grid double knitting to inform double knit lace. So where's this going next? And there's actually something in progress. The Wushing 5 Elements collection. This is actually something that I did pretty close to Victorian raffia initially. The original hat, and I can't find a photo of the original, but just imagine this one with slightly brighter colors. The yarn was, and no beads. The beads are a new addition. The yarn was something that I was very much enamored of, but is no longer in production. And essentially, I wrote 2 books in between the time that I initially designed it and then the time that I was able to get back to it. And in that time, the yarn had gone out of production, and I was forced to look for something else. I found this other yarn that I also loved, and this is 100 Ravens Yaksha, and it's a little finer, and it ended up showing off the pattern quite a bit differently. And I added in the beads because it was just fun to add in this extra concept that I hadn't played with yet. So what this does is it uses increases and decreases in a very much off the grid way. The shape that is showing up here is kind of rounded along the bottom from aggressive increases, and then pointed at the top from more gradual decreases. And I offset them so that the increases and the decreases from next door neighbors sort of offset each other, so that it doesn't get too out of control like the next one did. So the Wushing pattern collection, the 5 Elements collection, is actually something that they all use off-the-grid double knitting. Essentially what I'm doing with this collection is I'm giving it a theme, the 5 Elements theme, but then I'm also giving it an off-the-grid limitation to keep my creativity in check. And the general idea is that each one of these pieces uses that sort of round on the bottom, pointed at the top concept. Heavy increases at the bottom, gradual increases at the top. And what it creates is this sort of droplet shape. And in here you're kind of seeing it as flames. In the honey locust, you see it as leaves. This is the next pattern that will be coming out soon. I hope it will be coming out soon. It has been delayed quite a bit by the fire, and I am overdue for getting this out to the folks who have purchased the Wushing collection already. So this one is this is the one that gets out of control. It's a very slouchy hat, and it's slouchy by design, but it's also slouchy by necessity, because the way that this is done is just a kind of ridiculous amount of increasing and decreasing, predicated on the concept that each of the leaves has a net 0 stitches. So from the beginning to the end of the leaf is net increase and decrease of 0. So rather than compensating for those increases and decreases outside, I just let it happen. And because there are so many leaves and so many different configurations, it just gets really big before it gets really small. And so it ends up being a very slouchy hat. So the other one that is done now is the pluvium hat. This is going to be the 4th out in the Wushing collection, and it's a much more direct use of the droplet form that I mentioned. It actually has droplets. So the 3rd one is not designed yet, but will be using this shape for knot holes in wood, and it's going to be 3-color off the grid double knitting. So with each of these pieces, I'm sort of pushing the off the grid style in a different direction. either combining it with textures or combining with textures and lace, or doing something like multicolor double knitting with it. Of course, the first one has beads, and then in the end, it's going to be the last one, the metal hat, the metal element hat is going to be the most bizarre construction I think I have ever done. So possibly, assuming that it works as I expect it will, it is going to be very interesting. I hope people will enjoy it. I'll leave it as a surprise. So I did say that at the end of the live stream I was going to tell you what this chart creates, and here we are. It's this little knots and crosses thing that I showed in the Victorian raffia, and which the Silk Road tie was modified from. So, in answer to, I see chat going by, and thank you all for hanging around with me. I know there aren't as many folks watching live right now, but even if you're not watching this live, I hope you have gotten some enjoyment out of it. You asked about the Adenith shawl, and yes, the Adenith shawl was saved. Thank goodness, because I really didn't want to have to reknit or find someone to reknit that. Although, to be perfectly honest, I loved making it, and I would gladly make another one. I just don't have that kind of time right now. So, fortunately, I don't have to. It was saved. So, anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this live stream, and the next one I'm going to be doing, I'm trying to do these every 2 weeks. The next one will be October 16th, again, Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern, and I'm going to be talking about two-pattern and multicolor double knitting and how they're related. They are related. They weren't just things that I ended up figuring out around the same time. I figured them out around the same time because they are connected, and I'm going to explain how and why they're connected to each other. So until then, visit my website, double-knitting.com, and I hope that you'll stay in touch. Thanks very much.